The sun was setting behind the hills when Officer Daniel received a strange call from dispatch. The caller had reported hearing odd noises coming from the forest near Miller's Creek. It wasn't the first time someone had mentioned strange sounds from that area, but this time the caller said it sounded like wood scraping and someone moving around. Daniel didn't think much of it at first, but something in the caller's voice told him it wasn't just a prank. He decided to check it out himself before darkness completely took over. The drive to the forest took almost 20 minutes. The road was narrow, lined with tall pine trees that cast long shadows over the dirt track. It was the kind of place where daylight disappeared faster than anywhere else. Daniel rolled down the window as he drove slowly, the cool air carrying the scent of damp leaves and soil. The radio crackled occasionally, but otherwise, it was silent. When he reached the end of the dirt road, he parked his patrol car beside an old sign that read, "No trespassing private property." The sign was so faded it was barely readable. The forest beyond looked thick and quiet, the kind of silence that made you feel like you weren't supposed to be there. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and stepped out. He called out a few times, asking if anyone was there, but there was no reply. Only the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. His boots crunched against the forest floor as he made his way through the trees. He didn't see anything unusual at first, just fallen branches, old stumps, and a few animal tracks. Still, the air felt heavier the deeper he went, like the forest itself was holding its breath. After walking for about 10 minutes, he noticed something odd ahead, a small clearing with a patch of ground that didn't look natural. The soil was uneven, darker than the rest, and the leaves on top seemed recently disturbed. He knelt down to get a closer look. That's when he saw the corner of what looked like old wood sticking out from the ground. At first, he thought it might be part of an old fence or maybe a broken crate, but as he brushed away more dirt, the shape became clearer. It wasn't a piece of wood, it was a lid. A large rectangular piece with rusty nails and edges that looked worn down by time. He leaned closer and froze. The object buried in the dirt looked exactly like a coffin. Daniel's hand instinctively went to his radio. He pressed the button but stopped himself before speaking. What was he supposed to say? Found a coffin in the middle of the woods? It sounded unbelievable even to him. Maybe it was some kind of prank. He looked around again, scanning the trees with his flashlight. Nothing moved. No sounds, no footsteps, nothing. Still, curiosity got the better of him. He took a stick and gently tapped the side of the wooden box. The sound it made was hollow. Definitely not a log. His heartbeat quickened. He brushed away more soil until the full outline of the coffin was visible. It was old, very old. Dark wood cracked in several places with patches of moss growing on the sides. The lid had faint carvings on it, though most were too faded to read. He thought he saw a few letters, maybe initials, but the wood was too worn. Daniel felt uneasy. He knew better than to touch evidence, but the sight of that coffin in such a strange place pulled him in. There were no signs of a grave marker or any burial site nearby. No one was supposed to be buried here. The forest had been off limits for years, and there were no records of any cemetery in the area. He took a deep breath and lifted one corner of the lid just slightly. The wood creaked loudly and a wave of musty air hit his face. He coughed and stepped back. Whatever was inside had been there a long time. He decided to open it fully, carefully prying the lid loose with a branch. The moment he did, his stomach tightened. Inside, instead of bones or remains, there was a folded piece of tarp. It looked newer than the coffin, its dark green color still visible under the dirt and decay. The tarp was tightly wrapped around something rectangular. He hesitated for a moment, shining his flashlight over it. The way it was packed looked deliberate, almost too neat. Slowly, he reached in and peeled back one edge of the tarp. What he saw underneath made his skin crawl. It wasn't human remains, but a small collection of personal items neatly arranged. An old leather jacket, a pair of scuffed boots, and a photograph sealed inside a clear plastic cover. He picked up the photo carefully, wiping off the dirt with his sleeve. The picture showed a young woman smiling at the camera. Beside her stood a man wearing a police uniform, an older style that hadn't been used in years. The two looked happy, maybe even close. Daniel turned the photo over, hoping to find a date or name written on the back, but it was blank. He looked at the jacket again. It seemed familiar somehow. It had a small stitched patch near the collar, the kind used in police uniforms decades ago. He felt a chill go through him. This wasn't just some random burial. Whoever put this here wanted it found. Daniel stepped back and took out his radio. His voice was steadier this time as he called for backup. He reported what he found, keeping his tone professional, but his heart was racing. Dispatch confirmed they were sending a team to his location, but it would take some time. They were short-staffed that night. While waiting, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Every now and then he thought he heard faint movements in the trees. A twig snapping, leaves crunching. He flashed his light around, but there was nothing there. Maybe it was an animal, he told himself, but even then it didn't feel right. He crouched back near the coffin, shining his flashlight on the items again. The jacket had a badge imprint on the front pocket, worn and faded. The boots looked modern, certainly not from the same time as the coffin itself. He glanced around the area again and noticed tire marks in the dirt, half covered by leaves. They looked fresh. Someone had been here recently. Daniel's gut told him this was more than just a coincidence. The items in the coffin were too specific, too intentional. The photo of the woman and the officer, the uniform, the modern tarp, all of it seemed like a message, though he couldn't figure out what it was trying to say. Minutes passed, and the forest grew darker. The last bits of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, leaving only his flashlight beam cutting through the night. The silence was so deep that even his own breathing sounded loud. Then just as he was about to step back to the car, he thought he heard something, faint but clear. A distant whistle, almost like someone calling out softly. He turned sharply, scanning the forest again. The sound didn't come again, but the air felt charged like the moment before a storm. He started walking backward toward his car, keeping his flashlight pointed ahead. The coffin still lay open in the clearing, its contents exposed. For a moment he thought about closing it, but something inside him said not to. It felt wrong to touch it again. When he finally reached his car, he glanced back one last time. The clearing looked calm, still as if nothing strange had ever happened there, but Daniel knew better. Something about that coffin, those items, that photograph, none of it made sense. And deep down he knew that whoever placed it there wanted the police to find it, to uncover something that had been buried not just in the ground, but in time. As he waited for backup, Daniel couldn't stop replaying the image of that smiling woman in his mind. The man beside her in the old uniform looked proud, but there was something about his eyes, something uneasy, as if even in the photo he was hiding something. Daniel didn't know it yet, but this strange discovery in the forest would soon reopen a case that had been forgotten for almost 3 decades, a case everyone thought was closed. The forest was holding on to a secret, and now that secret had finally been found. He sat quietly in his patrol car, the sound of the night pressing in around him, and the only thing echoing in his mind was one question. Who buried a coffin with a police officer's belongings in the middle of nowhere, and why now? The forest, silent and still, offered no answers. Only the faint rustle of leaves and the creak of branches filled the air as the waiting began. When the backup finally arrived, the night had already settled deep into the forest. The sound of car doors closing echoed through the trees, breaking the silence. Officer Daniel stood near his patrol car, waiting. He could see the flashlights of 2 other officers weaving through the trees toward him. One of them, Officer Reed, called out, "You okay out here, Daniel?" "Dispatch said you found something strange." Daniel nodded, his voice calm but uneasy. "Yeah, you'll want to see this for yourself." The 3 of them walked through the dark woods toward the clearing. Their flashlight beams cut through the fog that had started to settle low on the ground. When they reached the spot, Daniel pointed toward the open coffin. The other officers stopped short, their faces showing the same shock Daniel had felt earlier. Reed crouched beside it, shining his light inside. "What in the world?" he whispered. "These things look new, but this thing's ancient." Daniel explained everything, the sound report, finding the disturbed ground, and what he saw inside. The 3rd officer, Patel, kept looking around, his hand resting near his holster. "You said you didn't see anyone?" he asked quietly. "No one," Daniel replied, "but there were fresh tire marks about 20 feet west. They looked less than a week old." Reed nodded slowly. "All right, let's get photos and bag these items. We'll call forensics first thing in the morning." They spent the next hour documenting everything. The jacket, the boots, and the photo were carefully sealed in evidence bags. The old coffin was left open just as Daniel had found it. The forest was silent except for the faint hum of radios and the clicking of camera shutters. When they were done, Reed stood up and looked at Daniel. "You did the right thing calling this in. This isn't something we can ignore. We'll bring in the crime scene unit tomorrow morning. For now, we'll post a marker and seal the area off." As they started walking back to their cars, Daniel couldn't help but glance over his shoulder. The coffin sat there under the pale moonlight, half buried and eerie. It looked like a ghost from another time, waiting to tell its story. The next morning, Daniel returned to the site with the forensics team. It was brighter now, but somehow the forest still felt heavy. The ground was damp from the night dew and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. Yellow tape surrounded the clearing. The forensic officer, a woman named Laura, was already setting up her equipment. "We'll run full analysis," she said. "You said there was a photo inside?" Daniel nodded and handed her the evidence bag. She looked at the picture closely. "This looks like it was taken not too long ago," she said. "Maybe a few years at most. But this uniform, I haven't seen that style since the 90s. That caught Daniel's attention. "You're sure?" "Positive," she said. "My dad was on the force back then. That badge and jacket design were replaced about 25 years ago." The word stayed in Daniel's mind as he helped the others mark and photograph the area. 25 years ago. Around that time, there had been a case everyone in town still whispered about. A missing officer and a young woman who vanished without a trace. The case had gone cold decades ago, and no one ever figured out what happened. Later that afternoon at the station, the chief called Daniel into his office. On his desk were the evidence bags and a printed copy of the photograph. "Sit down," the chief said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "You know who this is, right?" Daniel leaned forward to get a better look. The man in the old uniform, smiling next to the young woman, looked vaguely familiar. The chief sighed. "That's Officer John Riley. He went missing in 1998. The woman is Claire Henderson. She disappeared a few weeks before he did." Daniel blinked. "You're saying this is connected to that case?" The chief nodded. "It has to be. Riley was investigating Claire's disappearance before he vanished. The case files were a mess. Half the evidence was lost, and some of the reports were incomplete. It was one of the strangest cases this department ever had." Daniel sat back in silence. He remembered hearing about it when he first joined the force. Some of the older officers used to say Riley had run off with the woman. Others believed something darker happened, but nobody ever found proof. Until now. The chief handed Daniel a folder. "I want you to reopen the case. Work with forensics. See if we can connect this coffin to the old disappearance." That evening, Daniel stayed late at the station, reading through the old reports. Most of the pages were yellowed and handwritten. Riley had been investigating Claire's sudden disappearance from her family's home. According to witnesses, she'd been last seen getting into a dark-colored car late one night. Riley was the lead investigator, and some people said he'd grown obsessed with the case. Then one day he vanished too. His car was found abandoned near the same forest where Daniel had just found the coffin. Daniel leaned back in his chair, thinking. Was the coffin some sort of clue? Or a warning? Someone had gone through a lot of trouble to place it there after all these years. The next day, Laura from forensics dropped by with early lab results. "You're going to want to see this," she said, setting the file on his desk. "The soil inside the coffin doesn't match the soil from the forest. It's from somewhere else, likely near the riverbank miles away." Daniel frowned. "So the coffin was moved here recently?" "Exactly," Laura said. "Also, the tarp fibers are synthetic and modern, maybe just a few years old. Whoever did this, they used old wood but new materials to rewrap the contents. That made the mystery even deeper. Someone had found this old coffin, or built it to look old, and placed those items inside. But why?" Later that night, Daniel drove back to the forest alone. The forensics team had already cleared out, and the yellow tape fluttered softly in the wind. He stood there quietly, looking at the spot where the coffin had been uncovered. The ground looked darker now, like it remembered what had been found there. He walked slowly around the clearing, scanning for anything that might have been missed. That's when he noticed something small glinting in the dirt just beyond the tape line. He crouched down and brushed it off. It was a metal plate, small, rectangular, with faint engravings. He wiped it clean with his glove and could just make out the letters. JRC. He didn't recognize the initials, but they didn't match either of the missing person's names. Someone else had been part of this. The next morning, he brought the plate to the lab. Laura examined it under a magnifier. Looks like it was part of a nameplate from a box or container, she said. Could have come loose when the coffin was moved. Daniel nodded, deep in thought. Can we trace it? She smiled faintly. I'll try. But with just 3 letters, it's not much to go on. As days passed, more pieces began falling into place. The boots from the coffin had been custom-made, issued to police officers in the late 90s. The jacket matched records from Riley's uniform. That confirmed it. The items belonged to the missing officer. But the biggest question still hung in the air. Who had buried them and why now? One night, unable to sleep, Daniel pulled out the photograph again. He stared at the young woman's face. She looked happy, but there was something haunting in her eyes. The more he looked, the more he noticed small details, a reflection in the background like the edge of a building or maybe a car window. He scanned the back of the photo again, this time under better light, and saw faint impressions. Letters that looked like they had been pressed into the paper long ago but were never inked. It looked like a partial address. He copied what he could make out and ran it through the old town property records. To his surprise, it matched a farmhouse on the outskirts of town, the same area where the tire marks in the forest had led. The realization sent a chill down his spine. The connection was too strong to ignore. Daniel knew what he had to do next. Before dawn the next morning, he set out toward that farmhouse. The road was rough, overgrown with weeds, and the place looked abandoned even from a distance. But something told him this was where the next clue waited. He parked his car quietly and stepped out, the cold air biting at his face. The wind rustled through the broken windows of the farmhouse, carrying with it a faint creaking sound. He approached slowly, his flashlight scanning the ground. Near the front porch, he noticed something. Fresh footprints in the dirt. Someone had been here recently. Daniel felt a rush of tension. Whoever had placed that coffin in the forest might still be nearby. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The inside of the farmhouse was quiet, filled with the smell of dust and damp wood. The floorboards creaked softly under Daniel's boots as he stepped inside. His flashlight beam swept across broken furniture, old wallpaper peeling from the walls, and a staircase that looked like it could collapse at any moment. It was clear that no one had lived here for years, but there were signs that someone had been there recently. On a small table near the window sat a half-burned candle, its wax still soft as if it had been used not long ago. Next to it lay an old notebook covered in dirt and cobwebs. Daniel approached carefully, brushing the dust away before opening it. Inside were newspaper clippings, some so yellowed they looked ready to crumble. Each article was about missing people, mostly from the same decade as Officer Riley's disappearance. As he flipped through the pages, something caught his eye. One of the clippings was about the young woman from the photo, Claire Henderson. There was a picture of her from a local newspaper, smiling the same smile he had seen in the photograph. The headline read, "Local woman still missing after 3 weeks. Police continue search." Under the article, handwritten in pen, were the words, "She knew too much." Daniel stared at the note. The handwriting was uneven, like someone had written it in a hurry. He turned the next page and froze. There was another photo of Officer Riley, cut out from an old police newsletter. Someone had drawn a circle around his face and written underneath, "He never stopped looking." Daniel's heart pounded as he realized what he was seeing. Someone had been following this old case closely. Someone obsessed with it. The farmhouse was full of old evidence, as if someone had been conducting their own secret investigation. He kept looking through the notebook until he reached the back cover. A folded piece of paper was tucked inside. When he opened it, he found a map of the forest where he had discovered the coffin. Several spots were marked in red ink, one of which matched the exact place where the coffin had been buried. Another mark was further north near the river. Daniel took a deep breath. Whoever had drawn this map knew about the coffin long before it was found. Maybe even before it was placed there. He reached for his radio to call the station, but before he could speak, a sound echoed through the farmhouse. It was faint, but clear, a door creaking somewhere deeper inside. He turned quickly, his flashlight scanning the dark hallway. "Police!" he called out. "If someone's here, come out." There was no answer, only silence. Daniel waited for a few seconds, listening closely. Then another sound, the soft crunch of footsteps on old wood coming from the upper floor. His hand went to his holster as he slowly moved toward the stairs. Each step groaned under his weight. When he reached the top, the air felt colder, as if the whole place was holding its breath. He checked each room carefully. Most were empty, full of dust and broken furniture. But the last room at the end of the hallway was different. The door was slightly open and faint light spilled from inside. He pushed it gently. On the floor lay several large boxes. One of them was open, and inside were more old photos, police documents, and evidence tags. Daniel picked one up and read the label. It had Riley's name on it. These were official police records, the kind that should have been locked in storage. How had they ended up here? He looked around the room again and saw something else. A wall covered with photos, notes, and lines of red string connecting different people and places. It looked like someone had been piecing together the story for years. In the middle of the board, a large photo of Riley and Claire was pinned with a single word written across it: truth. Daniel stood silently for a long moment, trying to take it all in. Whoever had set this up wasn't just curious. They were determined to prove something. Maybe they were trying to finish what Riley started. He took out his phone and snapped a few pictures of the wall for evidence. As he turned to leave, he noticed a small envelope sitting on the windowsill. It had no name, only a single letter on the front. D. He opened it carefully. Inside was a short note, written in the same handwriting as the one in the notebook. It said, "You were meant to find it. Look closer at the photograph. The answer is there." Daniel's stomach tightened. Someone knew about him. Someone knew he'd find the coffin. He left the farmhouse immediately and called for backup. By the time other officers arrived, the place had gone completely quiet again. They searched the entire area, but found no one. Still, the evidence in the house was enough to reopen the investigation on a much larger scale. Back at the station, Daniel placed the photo under a magnifying lamp, just as the note had suggested. He studied it carefully this time, looking for anything unusual. At first it seemed normal, the smiling faces, the forest background. But then he noticed something small near the corner of the picture. There was a reflection, faint but visible, in what looked like a car window behind them. It showed a third person, blurry, standing just out of focus. Daniel zoomed in on the image and adjusted the light. The face was hard to make out, but it was definitely a man. And he wasn't smiling. He looked like he was watching them from a distance. He called Laura from forensics over to take a look. "Can you enhance this part?" he asked, pointing at the reflection. She nodded and worked on it for a while. When the image became clearer, she leaned back slowly. "This man, he's wearing a police badge," she said softly. "But not Riley's. The badge number is different." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "You can read the number?" "Barely," Laura replied. "But I think it starts with 31. That would make it one of the officers assigned to Riley's department at the time." They looked up the badge number in the old records, and it matched a name: Officer Howard Crane, a man who had worked with Riley on the missing woman's case. According to the records, Crane had retired a few years after Riley's disappearance and moved out of town. Daniel decided to pay him a visit. It took a few hours to track down Crane's address. He lived in a quiet neighborhood about 40 miles away, in a small house at the edge of town. When Daniel arrived, the place looked peaceful. Birds chirped in the trees, and there was an old truck parked in the driveway. He knocked on the door, and after a few moments, an elderly man opened it. "Yes?" the man said, his voice raspy but calm. "Mr. Crane," Daniel said politely, showing his badge. "I'm here about an old case. I believe you worked with Officer Riley back in 1998? The man's expression changed slightly, a mix of surprise and something else, unease. "Riley? That was a long time ago," he said quietly. "Why are you asking now?" Daniel hesitated, studying his reaction. "We found something in the forest near Miller's Creek. Some of Riley's belongings were buried there. We also found a photograph of him and a woman named Claire Henderson. Your reflection was in the background." Crane's eyes widened for a moment before he looked away. He seemed to struggle with what to say. "That picture," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know anyone still had it." Daniel waited silently. Crane finally sighed. "Riley was a good man. He cared too much about that case. He believed someone from inside the department was covering something up. I told him to leave it alone, but he wouldn't. Then one night he just disappeared. After that, everyone stopped talking about it. The files went missing. I thought it was over." "Do you know who he was investigating?" Daniel asked. Crane looked up at him, his eyes tired but sincere. "He never told me names, but he said the truth was buried somewhere near that forest." The words hit Daniel hard. Buried, just like the coffin. Crane shook his head slowly. "If you found that box, then someone wants you to keep looking. But be careful, officer. Some people don't like their secrets dug up." Daniel thanked him and left, his mind full of questions. Who had placed the coffin there after all these years? And why were they pushing him toward the truth? As he drove back through the empty highway, the sun began to set, casting a deep orange glow across the horizon. The forest loomed in the distance, dark and silent. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched again, the same uneasy sense he'd felt that first night. When he reached the station, he found another envelope waiting on his desk. No name, no return address, just like before. Inside was a small piece of paper with a single line written on it. "You're close, but the next place you search won't be empty." Daniel stared at the note for a long time. Whoever was behind this wasn't done yet. Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the note for a long time. The simple message, "You're close, but the next place you search won't be empty," kept echoing in his head. Whoever was sending these notes knew everything that was happening step by step. They had eyes on the investigation. It wasn't random. It was personal. He leaned back in his chair, the dim light from his desk lamp casting shadows across the wall. He couldn't stop thinking about Officer Riley and Claire Henderson. It was as if their story was slowly coming back to life through clues someone wanted him to find. But why him? Out of everyone in the department, why was he the one being led down this path? Laura from forensics walked in quietly holding a folder. "You're not going to believe this," she said, handing it to him. Inside were photos from the items found in the farmhouse. "The fingerprints on the notebook matched someone in the old database," she continued. "But here's the strange part. They match Officer Riley." Daniel looked at her in surprise. "That's impossible. Riley's been missing for more than 20 years. "I know," Laura said softly. "But these prints were left recently. The ink test shows less than 6 months old." For a moment, Daniel didn't know what to say. Either someone had forged the prints or Riley wasn't as gone as everyone believed. The idea sent a cold shiver through him. Later that night, Daniel sat alone in his car outside the station, staring at the forest road in the distance. Something deep inside him told him that the answer was still out there, hidden among those trees. The thought of the note, "The next place you search won't be empty," kept replaying in his mind. He decided to follow the map from the farmhouse, the one with red marks. The second marked spot was near the riverbank, not far from where the soil in the coffin had come from. The next morning, Daniel drove out before sunrise. The forest was covered in fog, making everything look ghostly and quiet. He parked near the river and stepped out, listening to the sound of water rushing over rocks. The air was cold and sharp, but peaceful in a strange way. He followed the trail marked on the map, using his flashlight even though daylight was breaking through. The deeper he went, the less peaceful it felt. The trees were denser, and the ground was soft and uneven. After about half an hour of walking, he came to a clearing with a small wooden shed, half collapsed and covered in moss. He pushed the door gently and it creaked open. The smell of wet wood and rust hit him. Inside, the place was empty except for an old metal box sitting on the ground. The box was locked with a chain and a padlock, but the lock was rusted enough to break with one strong pull. He opened it carefully, expecting maybe tools or junk. Instead, he found papers, old police reports, evidence photos, and cassette tapes labeled with dates from the 1990s. The handwriting on the labels looked familiar. It matched the notes he'd found earlier. Daniel picked up one of the tapes and read the faded writing. Interview, Claire H. His pulse quickened. This was big. These tapes could be the original interviews from the missing person case. He packed them into his bag and drove straight back to the station. In the quiet of the evidence room, Daniel sat with an old tape player and pressed play. The sound crackled, and then a voice filled the room. A man's voice, calm and professional. It was Riley. Interview with Claire Henderson, June 14, 1998, the recording began. Time, 6:42 p.m. Claire, can you tell me what you saw that night? A soft, nervous female voice replied, I saw someone near my house again. Same car, same person. They keep watching me. I tried to tell the other officers, but no one listens. You're the only one who believes me. Riley's voice answered gently. Do you know who it is? There was a pause. Then the woman said quietly, I think it's someone from the department. Daniel froze. That one sentence changed everything. The tape continued for a few more minutes before cutting off suddenly, as if someone had stopped it mid-conversation. Daniel checked the other tapes. Most were blank or damaged, but one other was labeled simply last recording. When he played it, all he heard was static for a moment. Then a hurried voice, Riley's again, sounded tense and shaky. If anyone finds this, don't trust the files. They changed everything. It's not what it looks like. I'm going to hide the truth where no one will think to look. Then the recording cut out. Daniel sat there for a long moment, feeling his chest tighten. Riley had known something. He had been close to uncovering it. Maybe that was why he disappeared. He showed the tapes to the chief, but the reaction wasn't what he expected. The chief's expression darkened as he listened to the words. When it ended, he looked at Daniel sharply. Where did you get these? Daniel hesitated. From the site marked on the old map. I think Riley left them for us to find. The chief rubbed his forehead. This case was closed a long time ago for a reason, Daniel. Be careful where you go digging. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried for good reason. Daniel didn't respond. He could tell the chief was nervous, almost too nervous, and that told him everything he needed to know. Someone in the department had been involved back then. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat in his small kitchen, staring at the evidence board he had made. Photos, notes, and names were pinned all over it. Riley's words from the tape played in his head again. I'm going to hide the truth where no one will think to look. He looked at the map once more. The last red mark was near the farthest edge of the forest, close to an old service road that hadn't been used in decades. It was risky to go alone, but he knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to finish what Riley started. The next morning, fog hung low over the forest again as Daniel parked his car by the old road. It was colder than usual, the air still and heavy. He followed the path on foot, guided by the red circle on the map. After nearly an hour of walking, he found it, a large mound of earth covered in thick vines and branches. At first, it looked like part of the landscape, but the shape was too defined. It was man-made. He knelt down, brushing away the vines, and uncovered what looked like a large wooden hatch. His flashlight glinted off a rusted handle. It took all his strength to pull it open. A gust of cold, stale air rushed out. Beneath him was a dark space, a hidden cellar. He climbed down carefully, the steps creaking under his weight. The beam of his flashlight moved across old wooden walls and shelves filled with boxes and papers. In the center of the room stood a single table, and on it a small metal box identical to the one he'd found by the river. He opened it slowly. Inside were more photos and a single envelope addressed to the one who still looks. He unfolded the letter and read it under the light. The handwriting was unmistakably Riley's. If you found this, it means you followed my trail. I couldn't tell the truth back then, they wouldn't let me. Claire wasn't running away. She found out that money from certain cases was being taken by people in uniform. When she tried to speak, they silenced her. I tried to protect her, but it was too late. They came for me next. I buried what I could, hoping someone honest would find it one day. Daniel felt his throat tighten as he read the final lines. The evidence is here, but be careful. They never stopped watching. The truth was never meant to come out. He looked around the cellar and realized what Riley meant. The shelves weren't just old boxes. They were filled with police files, records of cases that had vanished from the archives. Every missing page, every erased report, it was all here. He gathered as much as he could and made his way out of the cellar. When he reached the surface, the sun was barely visible through the thick fog. He took a deep breath, the forest air cool against his face. As he turned toward his car, he noticed something that made him stop. A figure standing near the trees, still and silent. It was too far away to see clearly, but whoever it was had been watching him. When he raised his flashlight, the figure turned and disappeared into the fog. Daniel's pulse raced. Someone had followed him there. Maybe they had been following him the entire time. He didn't stay to find out. He drove straight back to the station, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Whatever he had just uncovered wasn't just an old case anymore, it was proof of a cover-up. And now, someone knew he had it. That night, Daniel locked the files in the evidence room. The forest outside his window looked quiet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. He had answers now, but also new questions. And deep down, he knew that before this ended, he would have to go back to that forest one last time. And somehow, he knew, the forest still had more to reveal. Daniel didn't sleep that night. Every sound felt louder than usual. The ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, even the wind brushing against the window. He kept replaying everything in his mind. From the first day he found that old coffin to the moment he opened Riley's final letter in the hidden cellar. He had uncovered enough evidence to reopen the old case, but something inside him kept whispering that it wasn't over yet. Whoever had been watching him in the forest hadn't just been curious. They wanted to make sure he didn't take one more step forward. The next morning, Daniel drove to the station early. The sky was still gray and the streets were quiet. He wanted to hand over the evidence directly to the state investigators before anyone could interfere. But when he arrived, he noticed something strange. The evidence room door was slightly open. He had locked it himself the night before. His stomach tightened. He rushed in and his heart sank when he saw the shelves. The box he had brought from the forest was gone. Every file, every photo, everything had vanished. Only the envelope with Riley's letter remained on the floor, torn and trampled. Daniel's hands shook as he picked it up. Someone had broken in and taken everything. Someone who knew exactly what he had found. He ran to the front desk, calling out for Laura, but she wasn't there. The chief came out of his office a few minutes later, looking calm but distant. "What's going on, Daniel?" he asked, his tone too casual. "The evidence, it's gone," Daniel said, breathing heavily. "The entire box I brought from the forest last night. Someone took it." The chief frowned slightly but didn't seem surprised. "Calm down. Maybe one of the night officers moved it to another storage unit. I'll have someone check." Daniel stared at him. "You don't seem very concerned, sir. That box could blow open a 20-year-old cover-up." The chief met his eyes for a brief moment, then looked away. "Sometimes chasing ghosts doesn't help anyone, Daniel," he said quietly. "You should let this one go." And with that, he turned and walked back into his office. Daniel stood there, frozen. The message was clear. The chief knew. He had always known. Later that day, Daniel got a message on his phone from an unknown number. It was just one line. "If you want the truth, come alone tonight. Same forest road." He sat staring at the message for a long time. Every instinct told him it was dangerous. But he also knew this was the only chance he had left to find out what really happened to Riley, and to Claire. He grabbed his flashlight, his badge, and his body camera. This time he wanted to record everything. The sun was setting when he reached the edge of the forest. The air felt colder than usual and the trees stood still like silent watchers. He parked his car by the dirt road and started walking. The path looked different at night, darker, heavier, almost alive. As he moved deeper, he noticed faint footprints in the mud, leading in the same direction he was going. Someone had been here recently. He followed them until he reached the old clearing where the coffin had first been found. The dirt around it was disturbed again, as if someone had dug there recently. He aimed his flashlight toward the trees, and froze. A figure was standing a few feet away, partially hidden by the shadows. It was a man wearing a heavy coat and a cap pulled low over his eyes. "You came," the man said quietly, his voice rough but calm. Daniel stepped closer, keeping a safe distance. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer at first. He looked at the ground, then slowly lifted his head. The beam of the flashlight hit his face and Daniel's heart skipped. The man was older, with lines of exhaustion carved across his face. But Daniel recognized him instantly from the old photos. It was Riley. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the trees. "You're supposed to be dead," Daniel said finally. Riley gave a tired smile. That's what they wanted everyone to think. Daniel's thoughts raced. "The tapes, the letters, it was all you?"